according to the elementary principles of the world rather than according to Christ. For in him all the fullness of the deity dwells in bodily form. And then another verse that comes to mind here is Matthew 24:24. Easy address to remember. And that's the place where Jesus is giving his so-called Olivet Discourse. And he says, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Lead astray, if possible, even the elect. That's believers, those who are chosen by God. Then 2 Corinthians 11:3 is another verse that deals with this same theme. And it says, but I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. And he's talking to the church here, talking to believers, talking to Christians. And he's concerned that they would be led astray, that they would be deceived. And then Ephesians 5:6, verse 6 says, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. It hasn't been all that long ago. In fact, it was just this last month that you may have become aware, as I did, of an interview that Nicholas Kristof with the New York Times, you might recognize that name, he's an opinion writer for the New York Times, had an interview with Serene Jones, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, president of Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Did you see it? It's by any measurement an intriguing interview. And the more you read it, the more appalled and aghast you should be, in my opinion, because this is just a portion of it. Happy Easter, Reverend Jones. To start, do you think of Easter as a literal flesh and blood resurrection? I have problems with that. That's Nicholas Kristof. Jones says, well, when you look in the Gospels, the stories are all over the place. There's no resurrection story in Mark, just an empty tomb. Those who claim to know whether or not it happened are kidding themselves. But that empty tomb symbolizes that the ultimate love in our lives cannot be crucified and killed. For me, it's impossible to tell the story of Easter without also telling the story of the cross. Well, okay, so far so good. The crucifixion is a first century lynching. It couldn't be more pertinent to our world today. But without a physical resurrection, isn't there a risk that we are left with just the crucifixion? Kristof asks. Jones responds, crucifixion is not something that God is orchestrating from upstairs. The pervasive idea of an abusive God Father who sends his own kid to the cross so God could forgive people is nuts. For me, the cross is an enactment of our human hatred. But what happens on Easter is the triumph of love in the midst of suffering. Isn't that reason for hope? I won't belabor this by reading the whole thing. But it goes on. He asks another question. Isn't a Christianity without a physical resurrection less powerful and awesome? When the message is about love, that's less religion, more philosophy. She responds, for me, the message of Easter is that love is stronger than life or death. That's a much more awesome claim than that they put Jesus in the tomb and 3 days later he wasn't there. For Christians for whom the physical resurrection becomes a sort of obsession, that seems to me to be a pretty wobbly faith. What if tomorrow someone found the body of Jesus still in the tomb? Would that then mean that Christianity was a lie? No, faith is stronger than that. Kristof asks, what about other miracles of the New Testament, say the virgin birth? She says, I find the virgin birth a bizarre claim. It has nothing to do with Jesus' message. The virgin birth only becomes important if you have a theology in which sexuality is considered sinful. It also promotes this notion that the pure, untouched female body is the best body, and that idea has led to centuries of oppressing women. More and more and more of the same through this whole thing. I'll let you read the rest of it if you can study it.
Are they Baptist?
Are who Baptist?
This lady.
Oh no. She is ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ. Those two denominations have what they call, I think it's a pulpit sharing arrangement. She grew up in Enid, Oklahoma. Yeah, might say. It's also the home of Phillips University, which is a Disciples of Christ college, and I think her dad was a college professor there. All this to say, this is the result of what we're going to be talking about tonight, and that is the church in the changing world, 1750 to 1850. So tell me how in 2019 we get this from things that happened between 1750 and 1850. Well,
we have based on things that happened.
Well, what we're looking at tonight is this whole idea of the Enlightenment, and we've mentioned some scriptures that really are warning scriptures. They're warnings to the church, warnings to believers to not be led astray and not be deceived and not be taken in by plausible tales or by nice stories, or by those who would be like false Christs and false prophets, who, even those who do false miracles. And this is one of the things that Paul was writing about, was those who would, the apostle, or rather Matthew's writing about, when he talks about the false Christs and false prophets. They're the ones who would be doing false miracles, as it were. So we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment, which is maybe something that's familiar to you, maybe not too much. The major event in American history that was shaped by the Enlightenment thought is what? What do you think? A major event that was shaped by Enlightenment thought in American history. It's the Revolution, American Revolution. And so we're going to be looking at that, going back to this time period. 1750 to 1850 covers the time just before the Revolution, and then up to the time just before the war between the states. And it's during that time that we really begin to see some huge shifts, some huge changes going on in American religion, as it were. In some ways, we begin to see the Americanized religion, which we'll touch on that as we go further and further on tonight. We'll try to get through as much as we can. But we might ask the question before we get too far into this: what is the Enlightenment?
That's a Democratic Party.
Okay. When we think about the Enlightenment as a movement, you have to think of it in terms of reason. Because it's during this time that the move is made away from revealed truth and into reason as the measure of what is right and good. So reason replaces, in essence, revelation. After all, this is a church history course, so we're going to be talking about how it impacted the church more than anything. But when you think about the Enlightenment, certain names might come to mind. You might think of Jean-Paul Sartre, or you might think about Voltaire. You might think about, even on the English side of things, you might think of David Hume or John Locke. You might even think of Isaac Newton. he's in the Christian camp, but he's a very big player in this whole move toward the age of reason. That might be another way of thinking about it, is the move toward the reasonable man. If you've ever heard Bill Nye, the science guy, talking about the reasonable man, he's not just making that up. He's not just coming up with that on his own. He's using a phrase that came about as a result of the Enlightenment that said, we don't need revelation anymore. What we need is reasonableness. That actually led to all kinds of scientific developments, all kinds of technological developments, all kinds of good things that we can think of. But it applied the axe to root and branch of the church at the time. And it really had a very deleterious effect on it. But because the Enlightenment thinkers weren't just wanting to introduce reason into the conversation. What were they wanting to do? They were wanting to have unaided reason. Reason unaided by revelation, unaided by revealed truth, unaided by any doctrine of God or Scripture or salvation, any of those things. They wanted reason alone. And so this is really the basic idea. And because of that, religion took a back seat in the culture. And religion was seen as something to just promote morality and virtue. To the extent that it promoted morality and virtue in the culture, it was a good thing. To the extent it did not, it didn't. So that's where we get this whole faith versus reason idea. Faith became something other than what it had been, and reason became the big idea. And this is a challenge to Christianity, really at several points. And one of the big ones was Scripture. Under the thing of faith versus reason, there, Scripture is always considered an authority, perhaps the authority, especially in classical Protestantism. But now, reason is coming alongside this, and it's becoming more of a thing. In fact, you can even see this in what is now known in Methodism as the Methodist Quadrilateral, and that is faith, tradition, reason, and experience. And each one of those is given some weight of authority. That's in a Protestant denomination.
Say that again.
Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. And it may be called something else. I think of it as the Methodist quadrilateral, because it's kind of thing called Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. That's really not all that far removed from Roman Catholicism, which says Scripture plus the tradition of the church plus the magisterium of the church is our authority. So instead of magisterium, meaning the hierarchy of the church, you got that replaced with reason and experience. This is a real Enlightenment idea introduced into Christianity. So there's a big attack on Scripture because of the Enlightenment. Another thing is, so they move from revelation to reason, and then there's a move from God as the Creator, God and the Trinity, God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to God as a unitary being. Creator, probably. but just unitary. What does that word unitary remind you of? Unitarianism. That's where they get the name. By this time in the 1700s, all those Bible-believing congregational churches that were started by, Cotton and Increase Mather, all the heirs of the Puritans, for the most part, they got Unitarian. They didn't buy this skepticism that was beginning to rear its head in Europe, and then it crossed the pond over to our neck of the woods. So from Trinity to a simply unitary God, from the divinity of Jesus himself, God, the God-man, truly God, truly man, to the ethical norm of Jesus. Doesn't that sound so much kinder and gentler? Just to say, well, we believe in the ethical norm that Jesus gave to us, rather than this whole idea of his divinity. Because that's contrary to experience and reason. Those Enlightenment values. There's also something that came about during that time was a whole different idea of the atonement. So now the atonement is not requiring, in any real sense, the death of Christ. It's the example of Christ. He's the moral influencer. He's the moral example for us. So that's something that happened as well. Undercut all the belief in miracles that we see in Scripture, because that's an interruption of natural law, and that's not possible. That's the idea. And so Enlightenment religion, lastly here, provided, or for this paragraph at least, provided an alternative to the prevailing Calvinism of the day in American Protestantism. It began with the assumption of human free will and challenged the whole Calvinistic teaching, and I would say scriptural teaching, concerning original sin, limited atonement, predestination, all these things we're talking about in the ladies' class this morning. It starts out with the assumption of this human libertarian free will, and it leads to where we are today. So what does all that have to do with the founding of the American Republic? That's our third Roman numeral there, the founding of the American Republic. And what's the quote that's given there? What's that from? We hold these truths
Jefferson.
written in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. What a beautiful sentence. Certainly influenced by Enlightenment. This is Enlightenment thinking. Because pre-Enlightenment thinking would say something completely different. All men are not created equal in pre-Enlightenment thinking. All men are created as what they are for the glory of God, for the good of their place in the world, but certainly not equal. This is an Enlightenment idea. And it's one of the things that our whole republic was founded on. One of the things you're apt to hear today, you'll hear lots of discussion, and just throw this out there into the discussion and see what kind of responses you get. Is America a Christian nation? Well, now we've opened the can of worms, and we can kind of dive right in. Well, not to spend too much time on this, but looking at the same people and the same sources, you've got people on one side that will use the same founding fathers and the same sources as an apologetic for secularism, American secularism, on one side, and on the other side as a golden age of Christian statesmanship. May I suggest that neither one of those is accurate. There's something in the middle that I believe better represents what was going on with our founding fathers. And this is no slight on on those who truly were evangelical Christians. There were a few. People like Patrick Henry, who was a Baptist, who truly believed in the Scripture and believed in the Bible. Notable exceptions like that. But it wasn't all deists either. You know, that's the secular side. They'll say, well, all the founding fathers were deists for the most part. What's a deist? Anyway, deism. Think about
God's. Well, they don't think God's running.
yeah, it's kind of like it's the clock, cosmic clockmaker.
Yeah.
He makes the clock, winds the clock, and lets it go. And
Has
doesn't
no interaction.
no
Say
interaction.
that again?
Deism. It's like the cosmic clockmaker. There is a God. He is unknowable. He doesn't have anything to do with his creation other than
He made
making
his
it
own.
and winding it up like a clock, as it were, and letting it go. So for a lot of folks, they think of, well, like Ben Franklin, deist. Thomas Jefferson, deist. Well, there are a couple of notable ones. But that doesn't represent the bulk of our founding fathers any more than evangelical Christians do. We can't baptize them all into this evangelicaldom, and we can't put them all in the deistic camp. So what is this third middle way that we're talking about? If you were to read the public writings of the notable founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, am I missing somebody? Samuel Adams, John Adams. These are some of the notable names. If you read their public writings and their public discourses, their speeches and their communications like that, you could get the idea, oh, these guys are Christian. But if you read their private correspondence, you really get something different than that. Because what are they? What do all those men have in common? They are all politicians.
Oh.
Politicians. And that's not a bad, that in itself is actually not a bad word. It's, for the good of the people. But they, as politicians, they knew the people. They knew the populace. They knew what they needed to say and how they needed to say it in a way that would really take advantage of what the people believed and thought. But in their private correspondence, you get a little bit different idea. And you get to understand they're not deists and they're not evangelical Christians. They are theists. Or theistic rationalists would be another way of putting it. And again, this comes straight out of the Enlightenment. What is the difference between theism and deism? Go ahead.
Do you know Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Gospels?
Yeah.
It took all the miracles out.
You used scissors and tape to...
Said we got to take this stuff out. We expect people to believe it.
Yeah. And what better example of rationalism, because you have to have something that's reasonable. And so if the Bible's not revelation to us anymore, and reason is above all, then we've got to have a rational belief system. And the rational belief system says there is a God, He truly exists, and He truly governs in the affairs of men. Who was it that said that? That God governs in the affairs of men? I forget if it was Ben Franklin, if it was somebody. It wasn't. I don't believe it was Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, but the idea of theism is different than Christianity, because that God is more like what we're talking about, that sort of the unitary God. You can have Unitarianism, and it's still this idea of God exists. He still is personal in some way, and he didn't just set it all up and let it go, but he actually is working in the affairs of men. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about theistic rationalism. Greg Fraser is the one a few years ago, just about 2012. This is not original with him, but he's the one that sets this theory forth in a paper, or a thesis rather, and he describes theistic rationalism as a hybrid system mixing elements of natural religion, Christianity, and rationalism, with rationalism as the predominant element. So, it's no surprise that the founders use a lot of language in the documents that we see, especially the public documents, that look a lot like Protestantism. That was their world. That was the air that they breathed. That was the people that they served, for sure. But if you dig a little deeper, get into the private correspondence, you'll find a more revealing aspect of their identity being more in that whole concept of theistic rationalism. So the Christian response to this, to the Enlightenment, there's several things that we could say at this point, but we're going to look here at two people and then a movement that resulted from that. A couple of guys here that are listed are Friedrich Schleiermacher and Soren Kierkegaard. Anybody heard of Friedrich Schleiermacher? Only heard, yeah. How about Kierkegaard?
Heard Kierkegaard.
More often we're going to hear of Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard managed to stay in good with the Christian faith throughout his life. Schleiermacher is an more interesting guy. He's a German philosopher who taught in the University of Halle in Germany. But he was troubled by the whole idea that Christian doctrines were not rational. I mean, this is the thought that the rationalists were spreading out. All these Christian doctrines aren't rational. And so Schleiermacher's response was not to double down on the doctrine, but to say, you know what? The historical part and the doctrinal part doesn't really matter so much. The true essence of Christianity is simply feeling dependence on God. So what does that tell you? His whole move is away from the mind and toward the emotional side of things. And so there's this emphasis on emotion and feeling and piety. He emphasized Christian piety over objective truths. And you can see that throughout the arguments that he made. And you see in Schleiermacher the roots of modern day liberalism. If it were not for Schleiermacher, you would not have Serene Jones. The president of a supposed Christian theological seminary, which actually hasn't been a theological seminary in many, many years. It's a hotbed of progressive thought. Saying such outrageous things about the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. Well, Schleiermacher paved the way, and to a lesser degree, Kierkegaard did. We see there's a little overlap in their dates. Schleiermacher is between 1768 and 1834. Kierkegaard is a little bit younger, 1813 to 1855. So he's coming in as Schleiermacher is going out. He's a Dane, of course. He's in the Danish church. He is troubled by all this Enlightenment rationalism around him. And so he does something a little bit different than Schleiermacher did. And what he does is he begins to downplay both doctrine and morality. So Schleiermacher emphasizes the morality, he takes the doctrine out of it, says that's not necessary, but you got to have Christian morality. So Kierkegaard says you don't have to have either one, as long as you have radical free will and radical faith. That's the essence of the gospel according to Kierkegaard. It's Kierkegaard that we get terms like leap of faith from. Just taking a leap of faith without rationality entering into it. He believed truth is subjectivity. Boy, you can see where this is going, can't you? This is going straight into what we think of as modern day liberalism, or specifically Protestant liberalism. And then the next item there is something that was something that helped put the stop to this movement toward liberalism, and that's common sense realism in the Princeton theologians. John Witherspoon, have you ever heard that name? He was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. He was president of Princeton University. His dates are given there, 1723 to 1794. And he's really the one that, he was a Scottish transplant. He brought this idea of the Scottish common sense realism. When you see common sense, don't think of it like we use it today. Well, that's just common sense. Don't think of it that way. Think of it this way. Common sense in this phrase, common means universal, and sense refers to like perception or experience. So even though that essentially means the same thing, it's not how we typically use it today. He was saying universal experience realism. Everybody who lives in this world has the same experience of reality. Now, we could probably use a pretty good dose of John Witherspoon's common sense realism today, when everybody seems to have their own idea of reality, and there's no realism to it. There's no objectivity to it at all. But so what this idea did, this common sense realism did, was it appealed to the universal experience to reinforce Christianity rather than undermine it. So Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard on one side are saying, let's just gut Christianity, let's gut it of all the doctrine and all of the even the morality part of it from Kierkegaard's standpoint, and just leave the sense guys, the theologians, the realism guys, come along and say, no, we need to reinforce the truth of Christianity here. And that's really what led to Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary later became the bastion of truth, scriptural and Christian truth for 100 years, beginning in the late 18th century at least, and it was only toward the beginning of the 20th century and early decades of the 20th century that Princeton moved away from that and became what it is today. So by this time in the 19th century, you got a couple of guys coming along. Archibald Alexander and his student Charles Hodge stand for this balanced commitment to the Reformed faith, active engagement with all the challenges that were being presented to Christianity, and they preserved a robust Christianity, all really that lasted through the entire 19th century, and even later on, Hodge's son, Archibald Alexander Hodge, whom he named after his own teacher, takes up the mantle left by his father, and another man by the name of Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield. These two men stood in the late 19th century and early 20th century for the inerrancy of Scripture. Some have said that verbal plenary inspiration of the scripture, the inerrancy in the original autographs was invented by these men. It wasn't. But they're the ones who first began really writing about it and talking about it as something that was important, and began defending scripture in the face of criticism. Because what's happening with the Enlightenment, now that we're in the, let's say, the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, you've got this onslaught of scholars saying, those miracles didn't happen. You've got people saying, the scripture's not truly the Word of God. It's not God's revelation. It's just a book. It's just a historical record of how people perceive God to be. That's what you see happening. And so what you have is the rise of what's termed higher criticism. When we come to Scripture and the study of Scripture, scholarly study of Scripture, there needs to be a critical study of Scripture. But there's a difference between lower criticism and higher criticism. The difference between lower criticism and higher criticism is this. Lower criticism submits itself to the truth of Scripture and says, as a first order principle, an axiom rather, we believe the Scripture is true. Let's study it to see how all the truths of it fit together, and also have a high regard for it, a high respect for it. Higher criticism says it's just a human document, and we'll study it like we do any other literature, and we'll tear it apart because it obviously can't mean what it says on face value. That's really the difference between those two forms. So, any questions up to this point? Or any input?
Could you go back to point 3?
Yeah.
03?
Yeah. The founding of the American Republic?
Yeah, where it says all men are created equal.
Yeah.
Could they just not mean in worthy of dignity? I mean, what are you saying when you say all men aren't created equal? Could it just be that you're not defining equal the same way they did?
Well, this whole idea of equality of men, whether you define it as with equal dignity or whatever, is an Enlightenment idea. It really wasn't. It wasn't something that was present prior, at least not in the form that we have it today. Then, in terms of how it played itself out in society, can we make it scriptural? Can we go to Scripture and say, does Scripture indicate this as well? I think you can. But as far as the whole philosophical framework and the way governments were set up and the way really everything was.
So when you say that all men aren't created equal, were you meaning their lot in life doesn't work out equally?
Oh, yeah, I was speaking in terms of what the common idea would have been prior to the Enlightenment. Not that I believed that, but that,
okay, that's what I'm
yeah, clarifying.
Yeah.
Because remember, even in our study of English church history, you couldn't, you were who you were born to be. You didn't get out of that. You didn't have this whole idea of upward mobility.
So it's like the caste system in India.
Pretty much. I mean, maybe not to the extremes of that, but it was very, especially in England. Think about this. Think of the different statuses. If you're a commoner, you're not going to marry royalty.
Right.
If you do, it's going to be a very exceptional circumstance. You've got commoners, you've got the landed gentry, you've got the aristocracy, you've got nobility, you've got the royalty. And you don't have a lot of movement between those. The whole idea of equality is not a core value until we see I think primarily the founding of the American Republic. And I happen to think that it's an idea that is supported by Scripture in terms of equal, especially equal dignity, equal worth considerations. I don't think that it's purely enlightenment philosophy. I don't think it's certainly not antithetical to Scripture, like a lot of the Enlightenment ideas were. But it was new. You know, even the whole idea of religious freedom, that only came into its own in the late 17th century in England. To think that you could be loyal to the crown and not be a member of the state church, not be a member of the Anglican Church. Well, how can you be loyal to the crown and not loyal to the church over which the king or the queen is the leader, the head? So all these ideas that are fermenting in this time period go back to some continentals. Sometimes go back to the continental philosophers, like we were talking about with Jean-Paul Sartre and Voltaire. But you've got the English taking this on as well. Lots of good things happen through after the Enlightenment, but it also presented a real huge challenge. Like I said, it really put the axe to root and branch of the church of the day, and you saw a lot of problems that we still experience today.
Well, would the Enlightenment be the seeds of the thing you hear today about science versus faith?
Yeah, in a way.
Which is really a falsehood that they.
Yeah.
That it's.
And I think you're right to say the seeds of it, because most of the scientists of that day were still Christian, they would still consider themselves to be Christian. Isaac Newton being a case in point. I don't know that the philosophers of the day would have, but most of the scientists would. But yeah, it's in the same realm as today when you pit those two together, pit those two against one another. But, I wonder if we have time to get through this final section or not. It's 8:15.